Thank you, Connor. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Intelligence Squared and Faber event. As Connor just said, I'm Adam Biles, Literary Director at Shakespeare & Company in Paris, and I am delighted to be here with Rachel Cusk tonight to mark the publication of her latest novel, Parade. Because yes, dear readers, she has done it again. If, by doing it again, we all understand that to mean that with Parade, Rachel Cusk has once again refused to repeat herself. Once again refused to get stuck in any kind of literary furrow. Once again refused to write what might be expected of her. And rather has, once again, shattered the assumptions of the contemporary novel and reconstructed something breathtakingly new and radically beautiful from the rubble. Divided into 4 parts, Parade is the novel as kaleidoscope. As the reader turns the drum, moving from one section to the next, the concerns remain consistent. The artist's life, the female condition, violence, the death of a parent, marriage, the struggle over children. But the colored shards shift into startlingly different arrangements, allowing new insight, new revelation, and creating new art. This is an approach that not only allows the author to interrogate the fragmentary life of the human mind, but which makes her readers feel the sharp edges and pointed ends of those fragments, in their minds, but also in their bodies, and in all their wonder and terror. In this way, Parade feels both like a rupture from and an extension of what came before, particularly the memoirs, A Life's Work, The Last Supper and Aftermath, the trilogy of novels Outline, Transit and Kudos, and most recently, Second Place. So tonight, Rachel has offered to also talk with me about Parade in the context of these books, what caused them, how they were written, and how their reception would go on to shape what she would write next. Let's get to it. Please welcome Rachel Cusk to the Union Chapel. So to begin with that thought I just referenced in the introduction, that idea of Parade, at least to the reader, feeling like both a culmination of the last 2 decades, but also some sort of new departure, some sort of rupture from what you have been doing in those 2 decades. Did it feel that way in the writing of it?
I had an interesting conversation with our mutual friend Sheila Hetty when she was in Paris just now, and she said, oh, the thing about you is that I get the feeling that every time you write something, when you finish, you throw away all the tools you used to write that book. And so you have to go and find a whole new set of tools. So I think, and I thought about that and thought that that's true. And so I guess each book feels more unknown to me. As I sort of try and find it, sort of discerning what it is, and because that also involves, I guess, forgetting who I am, and having to come up with some new definition of that every time.
It's interesting you mentioned tools, because I remember the first conversation we had on stage was about Kudos and the Outline trilogy generally, and I'd asked you a question about the writing process, and you said it was like breaking rocks, which I could kind of understand in the context of those particular books. Was that the feeling as well with Parade? Was it breaking rocks each sentence, or was there a different flow to it? I
mean, I think if it isn't like the most difficult thing you could possibly do, then that's probably a sign that you're kind of repeating yourself. Or, and I guess the difficulty with this book was enhanced by the fact that I really felt a doubt about language, I guess, and language structures, and that partly being the result of moving to France, moving into a different language culture, reading a lot in French, beginning to think much more about what made it possible to read in another language. So what is this system that I can sort of do this in a different language, and also the kind of preoccupation, I guess, that has grown and grown in me about about the image versus language, and a desire to move closer to that, and how to do that in language. So in that sense, the difficulty was kind of mystical in some way, because I couldn't find language solutions. It had to be about perception in some very, very different way.
Let's stick with that idea, because I think it's very useful from Sheila Heti about the tools with which you write, and that idea of throwing them away. Because I guess when you throw away the tools to write a new book, there's two possible reasons you might throw them away. One is you just might make the choice to throw them away because you want to write something different, you want to write something new. And the other option, which I suspect is your option, is you look at the tools that you've got and they're no good for you anymore. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the impulse is to be free, and that impulse could almost be reduced to an instinct to free yourself from anything it is that you have. Because, and I mean, I think this is something that people, easily experience in their lives, not necessarily because they want to, I mean, very often against their own will, but when one loses familiar structures, you're left with a very, very, very different kind of conundrum and an opportunity to change, and it's extremely frightening. So I guess I am willing to be frightened in that way.
And that brings me on nicely to what I wanted to talk about, because that sort of loss of familiar structures does seem to have defined your career, or there's been or at least punctuated your career at different moments. So there's a moment in Parade, in the Stuntman section, where you write, "For the first time in years, I thought about the violence of childbirth, when I had passed as if through a mirror into an inchoate animal region, a place with no words." And if we're looking back at your oeuvre, it does seem that with a life's work, or with that moment of of passing through the mirror, that there was something, I don't know, some sort of rupture in your association with literature, with the idea of the novel as you had been previously writing them.
I mean, I guess I think with hindsight that I've tried to assert some idea of moral authority, not that I have moral authority, but a belief that morality is authoritative in living. And alongside that, an increasing realization that living is violent, and nationality is violent, gender is violent, parenthood is violent, marriage is violent. These structures that we live in do violence to us. And I think, this has been my experience of getting older and maybe not wiser, but more experienced, is not seeing the violence of outside, that we have so much information about, as an attack so much, but as being part of a sort of shared, or I suppose the culmination of a shared landscape in which violence is inherent. And I suppose by sticking very closely to those elements of personal experience that seem to me to be shared, or sort of relatively universal, and I guess expressing something about their violent nature. I've annoyed a lot of people and provoked a lot of strong reactions, but also, I guess, asserted this question about morality. Can at the same moment that you experience the violence of having a child, can you also use language to morally serve that experience? And I don't think that's something that people necessarily have the time or ability to do in the lived moment. But it has seemed to me that if I could live the moment and do that thing too, that would be valuable.
I pick up from what you're saying that perhaps there was something in the, let's say, the pre-A Life's Work novels, the novels you wrote before you made that sort of the transition into memoir writing. I don't know if memoir is quite the right word, but autobiography, or maybe we'll come on to that. Do you now look back at those novels as existing in some sort of almost sort of pre-lapsarian or sort of unconsidered part of your writing career?
Well, it's really difficult learning how to write. I mean, I really remember learning how to write and knowing that that's what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I had a feeling of, I mean, certainly a voice. I was a voice. I had a voice. But then there was this citadel, or more than that, you know, this culture, this canon, this history. And I think I felt that I mean, I was really young. I was like 24 or something when I wrote my first book. So I think I felt I had to like go the long way, like everybody else. You know, maybe if I'd started writing later, I would have started further on. I probably would have done.
Yeah. And in that idea of kind of doing it like everybody else, there's a lot of moments in Parade where we're kind of confronted with this idea that the concepts we have of artistic creation, whether that be the visual arts or the novel, are sort of shaped by the sort of the male, I guess, in a way. So there's a moment when you write about a sculpture. How could the female sex be commemorated in stone? Its basis lies in repetition without permanence. Its elements are unlasting yet eternal in their recurrence, as violence itself is. And that does almost make me think that perhaps with that sort of transition from novel writing to memoir, and then finding your way back to the novels when you started writing the Outline trilogy, that you were in some way trying to find your feet in a concept of art or a concept of the novel that was outside of the male, to find if that was possible in some way.
It definitely started as another example of the compartmentalization that really, really seemed to characterize, you know, motherhood, for instance, or the sort of early experience of motherhood. And I definitely, and you know, maybe this sort of early idea that I started with, and you know, presumably I'm not the only writer who started like that, of a kind of formality, or a canonical rigidity to the novel. And suddenly I was having experiences as a woman that I could find no way to put in the novels that I was writing, and you know, I look back on that as very much a crossroads, for want of, I can't think of a better word than that, where I think a lot of women, not just writers, women who work for companies, you know, go one way and then some other people go the other way, but you know, the right-hand turn, which is to say, okay, this stuff is happening to me because I'm female and my biological life is like this, and I have to take care of that and then pretend that it doesn't exist so that I can go and do this other thing. And you know, that's very often the way the world requires women to be. But it interests me that I think women writers do that too. There's a moment at which they think, am I obliged, because of my identity, to serve this material? Just because I've had a baby, does that mean I have to like talk about it and write about it, or can I just do what men do and like, write about the things that I'm interested in? And for whatever reason, for me, the answer was no. You know, I had to. I felt a duty, I suppose, and those experiences did not belong in the books I was writing, or as far as I could see, the books most people were writing. And so, this kind of uncomfortable producing of memoirs. I mean, I guess that was the word, because no one said autofiction in those days. Was a kind of schism.
Because I guess there's also the possibility that what you could do, because there's the content. So whether you're going to write about motherhood, but you could also, I suppose, you could try and fit that to the structures of the novel, or you could take the route which you took, which is sort of to say, okay, it's not just the fact that I'm writing about motherhood, but like I have to interrogate how we write about them.
Well, because this is where narrative becomes actively repellent. I suppose this was the first stirring of my feeling about that not only could I not, or a human not when in states of extreme personal identity, where the difference between being you and being that person over there is everything, and there's a handful of experiences in life that are like that, including dying, but having a child is one of them. In that condition, you can't, the idea of a narrative escape. You can't read a book, you can't watch a film, you can't escape, you can't desert the sight of your body, and I couldn't as a consumer of narrative, and I certainly couldn't imagine. It seemed, I suppose, that the falsity of that idea really hit me with writing a life's work.
One thing we find quite a bit in Parade are these portraits of male artists who seem almost to be permitted to set their lives aside and continue with their art, or at least to transfer a lot of the responsibilities of, for example, being a parent onto their wife, onto their partner, and to continue in their artistic practice. But there's also a sense of a certain inauthenticity to that too. Like, it's something which they seem to be encouraged to do by the system they find themselves in. But we get a sense that there's, in some ways, sort of diminishing returns from their art if they don't, I guess, embrace the rupture of becoming parents, for example.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things about living in our time, and I mean, this presumably is true of living in time generally, is and it's something that I increasingly in my work really try to respond to, is, the changing conditions. And, for the longest time, and I mean, this is why I really was interested in the idea of artists' biographies, which is basically the form that Parade takes. For the longest time, the male creator and what he needed to serve him in order for him to serve, whatever vision, that authority was absolute, and then suddenly it changed. It is changing. That authority has been called into question. Those men are being questioned, and that seemed such an amazing moment to interrogate, I guess, and part of what happens in the book is a sort of progression towards the idea of the female creator and the terms of that, as opposed to the standard egotistical man who is at the beginning of the book.
Could we hear a little extract from the book, the scene in the museum, I think?
Yes. I was actually just wondering if I could find the bit in but we haven't prepared that, so maybe I can't. Yeah, so there's just this little bit that I actually will read because it's kind of what we've just been talking about. So the early part of the book, all of the artists are called G in the book, but G changes, embodies lots of different artists. But the first G is the classic male G, and the section is really sort of spoken by his wife, in a sense. So I'll just read a little bit of that. G believed that women could not be artists. As far as G's wife was concerned, this was what most people believed, but it was unfortunate that he should be the one to say it out loud. She wondered whether it was her own indefatigable loyalty to him, her continual presence by his side, that had brought him to this view. Without her, he might still be an artist, but he would not really be a man. He would lack a home and children, would lack the conditions for the obliviousness of creating, or rather, would quickly be destroyed by that obliviousness. So she thought that what he was really saying was that women could not be artists if men were going to be artists. Once, she was in his studio for the visit of a female novelist who was struck as though by lightning by the upside-down paintings, much as G's wife had been herself. "I want to write upside down," the woman exclaimed, with considerable emotion. No doubt G found this a preposterous thing to say, but G's wife was quietly satisfied, because she herself felt that this reality G had so brilliantly elucidated, identical to its companion reality in every particular, but for the complete inversion of its moral force, was the closest thing she knew to the mystery and tragedy of her own sex.
Thank you. That idea of artist biographies. So, reading the book, I mean, I think there will be some artists which a reader feels they recognize, others may be less familiar. Could you talk a little bit about that urge to, in one sense, present the biography, but then also to anonymize?
So I've often felt that the lives of visual artists had a kind of immunity, partly because there was and possibly still is a kind of snobbery in the culture of visual arts about trying to interpret the image by means of like a person, a character, or the sort of circumstances of their lives. And so there seemed to be a very sort of startling and complete, not just even a sort of disconnection, but an actual obstruction of, and okay, in a few cases like Lucy and Freud, for instance, that then becomes a form of celebrity. Right. Once the visual artist actually is using that self or that autobiography. And it seemed to me that these lives that had resulted in an image had some, I don't know, biographical form to them that could be like a shape for living, could be interesting shapes for living, because they were essentially non-narrative. So that was kind of where I started, and how those, I mean, yeah, most of the G's in the book, in fact, all of them are roughly based on possibly recognizable artists, which is a kind of fun game that I think a few people are already trying to play, of like guessing who these people are. But I suppose there is a progression of sorts in terms of artists who in the end, I guess, succeeded in detaching their work from the story of themselves, which is very much where the book ends.
Yeah. That's such an interesting point, that detaching of their work from the story of themselves, because I think if we move on to the outline trilogy, that felt very much part of the project in that respect. I mean, you said earlier that the reception of particularly A Life's Work and Aftermath was sort of received as was an act of violence almost for you. I mean, I always have the sense that sort of if the British establishment come for you, come for someone in the way that they came for you, that you probably must be doing something right. But
it's the kind of thing it's really easy for other people to say.
Right. But there is a moment in Parade where you write, a novel was a voice and a voice had to belong to someone. And that seems, I guess, to perhaps in some way to underlie the attraction to you of the visual arts. Is that because these sort of it's a way to express yourself without a voice?
Yeah, I guess the trilogy was a developmental phase towards that, and definitely towards. I mean, it's not really about depersonalizing exactly, or sort of deadening the self. It's I suppose reproportioning the self in the context of other things and in terms of other things, and especially in terms of, I guess, what seemed to me a sort of grotesque loss of kind of balance in the information content of the average novel, and how that average novel was coming more and more to represent almost a space of personal fantasy, of kind of making things up, and the person reading it sort of installing you're making things up in their own head in a kind of private transaction that has something slightly sordid about it, for me, and feeling that the difference between pornography and fiction was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I think I started the trilogy wanting just to change that information structure and knowledge structure. I wanted the book to know much, much less, and the surface to say much, much more. And for that to give some kind of integrity back to the idea of a human being, which, I mean, I guess by the end of Kudos, I felt if I keep doing this, because I literally could have written 20 books like that, because once I'd understood how to do it, it was very, very tempting to keep on doing it. And if I do it a bit in this book, it could have become a kind of parody of itself. But I guess I felt by the end that I felt much closer to, interestingly, real anger, such as I had not found a way of, in all the provocative things I'd written that made other people so incredibly angry. I don't think I ever expressed any anger in my work. And suddenly, at the end of the trilogy, kind of there it was. So that felt like and violence. I mean, those two things. So I think since then, I've gone towards a different way of symbolizing these things, and a different way of expressing them.
That's very interesting, because I have heard in the past people talk about the trilogy as if it was a means for you to escape. although I've heard that expressed in the sense of kind of to escape the sort of the critical eye that was sort of so overbearing for your previous books. But from the way you're talking, I get the sense it was more of a sort of, in some way, an escape of the structures, in a way, of novel writing or writing generally.
Oh, and it was also there was so much conflict around, by the time I wrote Aftermath, so much horrible conflict around that work. And it was, I suppose the trilogy was a kind of peacemaking enterprise. It was just, I'm just going to love. All I can do in this space that I've been put is to love others. That's the only, because the idea of engaging in some kind of argument or some response to unpleasantness, and I think it was an attempt to find a peaceful solution.
Yeah. There is, I mentioned in the introduction this idea of sort of fragments and shards, and that's definitely, when I was rereading Aftermath in recent weeks in preparation for tonight, it's fascinating to find that is the vocabulary of Aftermath. It is of things shattering, of fragments, of shards. And we do find that in Parade as well, but in a, I don't know, it's different in nature. It almost feels like the shattering is not of the external life, but of the internal, in a way. And so there were a couple of moments when the narrative voice is the we. And on my first reading of the book, I projected the we to be either a couple or a group of siblings. And on my most recent reading, I lost confidence in that reading and almost felt the we as potentially could be the sort of the single person expressing themselves in the plural. Am I barking up the wrong tree there?
No, it was an interesting moment of feeling that something in the process of writing this book brought me to the end of I, and of ever being able to use I ever again, and of we being, I mean, it's something that Annie Ernaux does in The Years, which I promise I only thought of after I'd done it. I was not copying, or not consciously anyway. It felt like a humble solution, and I guess something connected with age, and a feeling of again, belief structures and narrative structures kind of breaking down for everyone. And you know, one of the kind of beautiful possibilities of writing is to try to detect change and respond to change, and to hear things changing, and I guess it felt to me that again, you know, this may be something about a life stage, that surrendering of belief, and particularly narrative belief, could be expressed as I becoming we.
Yeah. It's interesting, this idea of life stage, or sort of changes with age, because that's definitely a shift that we notice in Parade, is oddly from, I guess in previous works, from the narrative voice being one of the parent. So there is a moment where you write, my own history of motherhood feels like something far upriver. And but because of this stage in life that a lot of the characters are, or characters I use loosely, but in the book, it's almost like they become children again, because they're reckoning with their parents who are at the end of their lives. And that did feel something that was crucial to this book in a way that perhaps because of when you wrote them in your life, it was less significant to something like the Outline trilogy.
I mean, I think that, my kind of pretty age-old belief about artists as being people who never left childhood, who've somehow managed to remain in the childhood state, really found its kind of opportunity here because the sort of terror of people in their lives trying to enact authority themselves, trying to be adults, having to deal with, their own parents dying or their children becoming adults, or that it felt to me like that terror of enacting the self in the various available structures, to put that in a context of almost like the childlike authority of the artist, was a very useful thing to do at this point.
Is that sort of the artist remaining the child in the sort of in the state of the I guess the sort of the natural creativity and sort of expressiveness that a child has, which is kind of crushed out of them by the various structures of society? But is there something almost kind of pre-civilization to that? Like, one of the things that kept coming up in my notes when I was reading Parade was that it feels like, I don't want to go use the word kind of primal or primordial, but it definitely feels like of all of your books, it's like this taps into, sort of something pre-civil in a way that's perhaps your previous books didn't.
Yeah, I think, one of the questions I had writing Second Place was about form and formlessness, and trying to find a form that could possibly express this idea that I had about kind of post-biological female life. So, post everything, essentially, that part of life for women and for men that seemed to me that people sort of emerged from gender in some way, but that also this was a very, very undefined phase of experience for a lot of people, and I found a strange form for that, and in Parade, I guess that I was kind of back with that problem again and yet it seemed that the problem had got even more sort of extreme, because and particularly around violence, death. It felt like it felt like a crisis of that felt like a crisis of form that actually was part of people's lived experience, that there were no particular answers to, that you could only be very sorry about whatever it is that is happening to people as their lives kind of go on, and so I guess that I don't know if it's an answer because I think it is an answer in people's lives. The question of why we read books, there's been lots and lots of more or less trite, explanations of that. But actually, why we look at things, why we look at created objects, paintings, things that have no words, and I think it might be this feeling of almost not wanting things to be described, not wanting them to, or that they're beyond description, or so that's kind of where I'm trying to get in the book, and it's a kind of difficult thing to describe, in fact.
And it also, I think, unearths certain ideas and certain reflections which feel quite taboo today, and I think it's quite rare in like the early 21st century to find things. And one of them was this idea of the kind of regenerative power of death, which of course was something that existed in sort of ancient civilizations to the point where people would sort of eat the bodies of those that had died and sort of take the strength from them. But it felt like something we don't encounter much in literature, this kind of reckoning of sort of, death is held as this tragedy, which we're all supposed to kind of sort of accept almost unquestioningly, and you don't accept that unquestioningly in this book.
No. The unnaturalness, the idea that unnaturalness could persist, that artificiality could persist right into the loss of existence seems absolutely extraordinary to me. So that's,
you've referenced violence in different forms throughout this conversation so far, and there are several moments of violence, different types of violence within Parade, but there's one in many ways which feels quite foundational. It comes near the beginning of the book in the stuntman section, and I was hoping you might read that little bit for us.
So this is this might be the last bit of supposed autobiographical writing that I will ever write. And it had to go through a lot of processes to get written. One morning, walking along a quiet, sunny street where people sat at pavement tables drinking coffee, I was attacked by a stranger who hit me forcibly in the head. My assailant was a woman, deranged by madness or addiction, and this fact of her gender caused difficulties, both in the recounting of the event afterward and in my own response to it. I had not noticed her approach or prepared myself for the blow, which left me bleeding on my hands and knees in the road with no understanding of what had happened. A crowd instantly gathered. People rose from their tables, shouting and gesticulating. In the pandemonium, the woman walked away. The onlookers were pointing at her. She had stopped on the street corner and turned around, like an artist stepping back to admire her creation. Then she shook her fist in the air and she vanished. It occurred to me in the time that followed that I had been murdered and yet had nonetheless remained alive. And I found that I could associate this death in life with other events and experiences, most of which were consequences in one way or another of my biological femininity. Those female experiences, I now saw, had usually been attributed to an alternate or double self, whose role it was to absorb and confine them, so that they played no part in the ongoing story of life. Like a kind of stuntman, this alternate self took the actual risks in the manufacture of a fictional being whose exposure to danger was supposedly fundamental to its identity. Despite having no name or identity of her own, the stuntman was what created both the possibilities and the artificiality of character. But the violence and the unexpectedness of the incident in the street had caught my stuntman unawares.
Thank you. You said just before you read that may be the last piece of directly autobiographical writing. Would there have been Parade in anything like that form without this incident?
Well, it's funny. I was reading just now the most recent Edouard Louis book, Monique Sévade, about his mother getting away from the most recent of the dreadful men that she has sort of surrendered her freedom to and been kind of imprisoned by, essentially, over and over again. And he, at a certain point, has to give her money. And this money that he gives her enables her to survive, because she has no capacity to survive on her own. And it's a beautiful book. It's very beautifully described, this, because he says, I wrote, because Edouard Louis wrote this book, The End of Eddie, which was about the absolutely appalling, sordid violence and horror of his childhood and his family, including this mother. And his family were very, very angry and upset that he did this, and he sort of severed relations with him for a long time. And so as he pays out this money, he says, and his mother is extremely grateful, and their relationship improves, but he says, if those things hadn't happened to me, so if I hadn't written that book that my family so disapproved of, I would not now be able to help my mother. So if I hadn't written about how terrible my mother is, I would not now be able to save my mother. And in fact, if my mother hadn't been terrible, I would never have written the book that has saved my mother. So suffering, no book, suffering, book. So it was kind of interesting, and I wasn't sure. It sounded nice. I sort of thought, okay, I'll need to kind of do the maths on this one a little bit more. But in terms of this incident that the stuntman, the idea of the stuntman came from, I guess I thought that one would have to see it as meaningless, the event itself as meaningless, and I think that that really, in the end, was the clue to its meaning, because I could not see how something like that could ever give rise to a meaningful element of a book. But in the end, I thought actually it unlocked a resolutely closed door that led to the body, and the question of the body's meaning and the body's life, and its memory and its experiences. And I thought, I'm very nervous about using, experiences that are exceptional, that are not things that happen to most people. But I felt that this, if you look at it as something in a chain, then actually it does happen to most people in one way or another.
Yeah. It's interesting that use of the word unlocked as well, because that was something that exactly that word I wrote in my notes, was this idea that it felt that, there's all these different structures of types of violence considered in the book. And yet it seemed that it took this kind of, in a sense, this act of bodily violence from one person to another to clarify, in one sense, that all of these other
in a sense, I guess I thought in the end that it was a version of throwing all the tools away. It was kind of the same thing, being kind of broken down back to something. In the end seemed, and again, it seems to me that that's a model that arises a lot in living, in the way that people live. And that's not to say that suffering is good for you, or that suffering, I don't quite agree with Edward Louis, that suffering, creates art or makes people artists. Suffering is bad and, should be avoided. But there is a loss of belief that is a consequence of it, and therefore a possibility to question structures of self and identity that so often end up obstructing change and obstructing one's access to truth. And so in the end, the kind of violence of that breaking down, I guess as long as I could see it in the context of other kinds, more natural or more acceptable kinds of violence, it came in the end to feel sort of instructive.
Yeah. That idea of acceptable is interesting, because it's sort of, it's acceptable means, not exactly that we validate it, but we accept it. We sort of, we know it's there, we see it, and we don't do anything about it. And yet, perhaps these sort of awful acts of suffering, they in some way sort of provoke us to engage with it. So there is a moment in the final section of the book, you write about the violence of capitalism, and it's fascinating to see that, to have that juxtaposition, that sort of at the beginning of the book, an act of like individual violence from one person to another, and in one sense at the end of the book, it is sort of the lines being traced right out to the very structure of our civilization.
Which I think only, because if you think about how, if you wrote a story about, I don't know, domestic violence, say, if the violence that I was describing here was something kind of known in my life or in a person's life, it would be much harder to connect it to anything outside itself. And I guess that's the other thing that I kind of discovered about that incident, that its impersonality was a connection to other kinds of impersonality that we have so much of in our lives without even really ever admitting it.
Yeah. We are coming towards the end of our hour together before we turn over to the audience. So in a few minutes' time, if you do have questions for Rachel, do get them ready, and we'll get microphones to you.
Maybe I should read a little bit of the last bit.
Oh yes, please do.
Just to,
And then I do have one more thing I want to ask you before.
Okay. I'll just read this short couple of pages from the last section, which is the beginning, really, of the we voice. So the section's called The Spy. Not long ago, our mother died, or at least her body did. The rest of her remained obstinately alive. She took a considerable time to die and outlasted the nurse's predictions by many days, so that those of us who had been summoned to her bedside had to depart again and return to our lives. No one cried at her death, though among the congregation at the funeral there were some outbursts of shocked weeping, as though at the sight of death being surprised in the act of stealing from life. It was the entrance of the coffin, rather than the death itself, that constituted the violence of this act. The coffin was shocking, and this must always be the case, whether or not one disliked being confined to the facts as much as our mother had. The body inside the coffin was entirely factual. She had never seemed to take much notice of her body. It had been her vehicle, that was all. But its authority, it turned out, had been absolute. For a while afterwards, there was a feeling of lightness, a feeling almost of freedom. The violence of death had the appearance of a strange generosity. A capital sum had been returned to the living. We, on the side of life, had been in some way increased. But in fact, an unease remained, which grew, and which was our mother's impenetrable bequest to us. There ought to have been a feeling not of freedom, but of loss. If there was loss, then it was of something we had never had. We were free simply from the conundrum of this double loss. It was noted that at the funeral we had remained unmoved. It was a day of extreme, almost frightening heat, like the day of Meursault's mother's funeral at the beginning of Camus' L'Étranger. Meursault's own seeming indifference that day was also noted. It later became a central piece of evidence in his trial and conviction as a heartless killer. Was our indifference likewise a philosophical refutation of the social contract? Had we too run the risk of being arrested and convicted for the failure to adhere to cultural and moral norms? Months later, at dawn on the 9th floor of a hotel in a northern city, standing before a view of astonishing ugliness, it became evident that our mother was accompanying us in a way she had not when she was alive. Far below, people scurried across the concrete spaces in the cold grey morning. A violent wind was blowing. It shook the power lines and the leafless trees. It rattled the hoardings outside the shop fronts. It upended the litter bins and sent their contents whirling madly into the air.
Thank you. Actually, it's very appropriate, that section, for the final question I did want to ask you, because it mentions, you mentioned Meursault and L'Étranger, and he seems to be a character. I was going to ask you about catharsis. And Camus seems to be a writer, and Meursault seems to be a character that refuses catharsis, in a sense, actively refuses it. But I'm curious to know, I suppose, if that catharsis as a concept is meaningful to you when you do have these moments of kind of rupture and trauma. I remember, I know the risk of asking this question because I remember asking it to Karl Ove Knausgaard after he'd written his kind of 3,000 pages of memoir, and his response was no catharsis whatsoever.
No, that's my response too. The opposite of that.
The opposite. Would you expand on that?
No, it feels like total discipline is required. That's. I can't think of anything less sort of releasing and kind of unburdening. It's very, very much the opposite of that.
Yeah, I suspected as much. Thank you. It's over to you. If you have a question for Rachel, raise your hand. We have ushers with microphones. We'll take them in groups of 2 or 3, depending on where they're coming from. And if you do have a question, do make sure it is a question rather than a comment, if possible. That would be very much appreciated. So we've got one there and one there. So let's begin with those two. And that's the lady at the front there. Okay, you first.
I just had a question actually about language, because you mentioned learning French. And I remember when I learned Beckett, he obviously wrote in French because he didn't grasp the language. And he said it afforded him a kind of clarity because it was completely new and he had so little of it. And I wondered if when you were reading, you had sort of a similar experience where you're reduced to knowing, and how that affected your writing.
Completely, and no, it's a really good question, because that has been a kind of revelation, I guess. First of all, the incredible putting down the baggage of English, and then really beginning to understand what intelligibility was, what made a sentence intelligible, and of course also what made it unintelligible, and feeling, because it's something that I'd already been interrogating a lot, why do sentences go like this? Why do we, there are these sentences that are like Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, that the whole world is using this sentence, driving down this sentence, and isn't there some other sentence that we could write? And so I think that felt like a complete, almost detachment from the earth, of thinking, right, I'm not even in English anymore. I'm now on this rocket to Mars, French, with none of that weight of association. And I guess I could have done what Becca did and sort of worked this out by that way a lot earlier. But it's been a very transformational experience.
There's a lady just there.
That was fascinating. Thank you both. I'm one of the people trying to puzzle out Parade, and I know you've used initials before rather than names, which seems to me part of the project of getting rid of character. But I was wondering if there was any special significance to G.
So, I actually am not going to tell you the truth because it's so boring. But it's in fact fairly random. But it came from. It actually started as that and then became another initial later and then went back to being G again as I tried to work out whether I was likely to be sued by anyone. So, so that's... And then I realized that this is actually a very, G is a rather over... meaningful initial to have chosen. So I think I'll leave it for others to give it that meaning.
Okay. Who would like to ask a question next? There's a lady there, and there's one over there as well.
Thank you. Hi. I actually have more of a general kind of question because reading all of your books, I've been thinking that Vladimir Nabokov, he said that the art in its truest shape and form must be completely cleared of all the ethical, philosophical, humanitarian, social, any sort of, messages or statements or anything. How do you think your work, is it in line with Nabokov's vision of pure art, or are you really trying to convey some message? Thank you.
Very proudly not in line with our friend Nabokov. No, I completely don't agree with that. I think maybe that was a male prerogative at a certain period that now looks more and more suspect and more cosseted. And I think there's once we move out of the terrain of that, people need to explain themselves. They need to explain who they are and where they've come from and what's happened to them and their politics and the rules that they've had to live by, and you cannot do that. One of the things that I really write about in this book is the thing I was talking about at the beginning, but this terrible obligation that any marginalized artist has to talk about their marginalization, they're not free. And one of the artists I do talk about, and I will say who it is Norman Lewis, the painter who wanted to paint abstract paintings and kind of wasn't allowed to, because why wasn't he painting black experience? He can't just go off and be an abstract painter. And I think that is such an interesting area to interrogate, this duty to represent, to stay in representation because of the politics of your experience, and that art has to put up with that. It has to make space for it, because that is change. That is the now. It's not a static thing. It's not a statue.
We'll have a question over there in just a moment, but somebody has asked a question online which maybe feeds into that. This person says, it feels like fewer and fewer major novelists feel comfortable engaging with ideas and society through non-fiction. Is that just a natural shift, or are novelists increasingly worried about what the consequences might be of speaking out in essays on non-fiction in the way public intellectuals so often did in the past?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I suppose it's... no, I don't think they are. I don't think they are. I think it's public intellectuals, what is that now? I don't know. It's really hard to know what to think about what's happening now. It's really, really hard to work it out. And, maybe that idea of kind of lecturing from the pulpit is kind of not appropriate anymore. Maybe writers are trying to find different non-pulpit based locations to actually, as I said at the beginning, assert or construct or try and read some moral authority, because I think we are living in a horrible feeling of collapse of moral certainty of past times, and I don't actually believe that. I just think that this is like an amazing moment to actually build some new ideas about living and some new ways of representing stuff, and it's maybe it's going to have to happen in a more kind of homespun way for a while. I don't know if that answers that question, but
there was a question over there. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, thank you. Oh, am I really loud?
No,
it's all good.
I'm really loud.
It's like echoing around my head or something. Yeah, I really enjoyed that and found it really interesting. And I think I just wanted to hear a bit more about, you said something about learning how to write. And I'd just really love to hear a bit about what, for you, that involved. And what learning how to write kind of looks like.
It involved being on my own in a room for about 2 years when everybody else was living in London and having a lot of fun and going to parties, and I was on my own with a typewriter and paper and Tipex, which was what you had to do in those days. It was like, and it was like learning to play the piano, like learning Chinese. I really had the feeling that I had to learn how to do this, and I did that, on my own, I guess. And it seems strange to me now that I had absolutely no kind of doubt. I never asked myself what I was doing, or that, which now seems very, very odd to me. But yeah. I just wrote things again and again and again and again until they were right.
Okay. If you could stand up if you have questions, just so the ushers can find you, that would be helpful. I think there's a couple near the... there's one over there. Okay, there's one over there, and there's two near the back here. Let's begin with the lady over there. Yeah.
Do you have a right... Oh, sorry. Is it me? Yeah.
No, well, we'll take this lady first and then you, sir.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Obviously, Parade and Second Place are both concerned with visual artists, and I wanted to ask for you what the difference or perhaps the relationship between visual art and writing is, and perhaps kind of in relation to another one of the preoccupations of the book, which is truth. Thank you.
Well, we sort of talked about this a bit earlier. The idea of the image versus the text, and I guess increasingly as I get older, I've become very jealous of visual artists and wish that I was one, because writing is so explanation-based, and getting it away from narrative, which is so preposterous, is why not just play the piano instead, and sort of forget about these things. So I guess I've tried to put my work in the presence of the image, and to try and shape it more as a visual form, which I think is your feeling of it as having this slightly sort of unexpected or unusual shape.
Yeah.
So I think I'm really trying to be influenced, or allowing myself to be truly influenced by what a visual image is, and that to me is a sort of philosophical situation to be putting myself in.
We'll come to you, sir, in just a moment. There was just one more from someone online, which I just want to broaden out, connected to the question the lady asked at the beginning. So someone asked, which writers working today do you particularly like?
Oh, no.
But I'm just curious more about your experience in France. Like, has there been any particular French writers you've engaged with?
Yeah, massively.
That have sort of shaped.
Well, Duras, Marguerite Duras has really, really. So I think she somehow does already what I am so painfully trying to make my way towards doing, because not only does she write in this radically unnarrative framework, but she uses, so like a painter can just paint the same thing over and over and over again, and nobody ever thinks that that's strange. In fact, you would think that they were just advancing on their goal, and yet if a writer does that, but she does that, she does it. She uses her experience very differently as a three-dimensional concrete thing that she can walk around and look at from different angles. And I think it's really this burden of explanation that I'm trying to rid myself of, that the visual artist does not have. And that's, a writer like Duras, absolutely, because she's partly expressing a sort of outsider status by doing that too. She's saying, I don't belong to this country. I don't have, and that's another incredibly important aspect of narrative and language, that it's, you've received it. And so to actually hold it away from herself in the way that she does, that was very revelatory for me.
Okay, so at the back.
What is your writing routine, if you have one?
That's a nice old-fashioned question.
That's very basic stuff. And do you enjoy writing?
Writing is like the most fun when it works properly. It's the most fun there is, I guess. And I don't have a writing routine. Increasingly, once I'm writing something, I just write it all the time until it's finished, and then I have to wait for ages until I have another idea. So,
I saw there was a question there, the gentleman there, and then one behind as well.
Thank you. At what point did the outline trilogy become a trilogy? Was it something that you knew would take 3 separate books to produce, or was it? Okay.
I think towards the end of Outline, it became clear that it ending would kind of radically falsify the whole thing in reverse, and the whole point had to be that this was a continuing situation, I guess. This was not a story that had an ending. And, I don't know whether readers felt that it was kind of stretching things too far to write 3 books like that. I don't know. I mean, they're all kind of relatively short, so I guess I could have just written one massive one, and no one would have minded. But no, it developed because I was learning. I had to learn so much about what I was doing to be able to do it, if that makes sense. And so a lot of it only kind of became clear to me once I was, sort of towards the end of the first book. Once I really understood what this was, then I could begin to see, and that has remained actually fairly true of my writing process now, that I sort of accept. I always used to be very kind of, I never start a book until I can write the last sentence, and I could write it backwards, and writers should know absolutely everything about the book that they are writing, and this whole idea that the characters speak to me and that I don't know, I used to hate all of that. And but now, in fact, I think not knowing has become quite interesting to me.
There was a question, just there.
Hi, thank you for your work and for taking the time to answer hard questions on a process that is obviously quite difficult. I wanted to ask about the semi-autobiographical bit you read just now. In that, aside from the sort of obvious physical violence of the moment, you, I assume, are also talking about the sort of the social violence of somebody who's disabled and sort of in a society that can't help them, and so they're acting in this way, and also the sort of disruptive violence that you felt having this expectation of this person was a woman and she still did this, and you were really taken aback by that. But in that context, you then say, you bring up sort of the lived experience you've had in being informed by your biological femininity, and I was wondering why make that switch, and if that is also a political choice, as you have referenced previously.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think, later on in that chapter, the narrator, comes to the conclusion that this violent act by this woman was an artistic gesture, and that for now the street was her studio, and she did that, because really that, what is an artist doing but proving that they exist by making a mark on something else, and that this kind of origin of self-expression in violence, because in the rest of it there is an awful lot about why women have not been able to express themselves and still are very often prevented from expressing themselves. So I guess that was a kind of idea. Relating it to other physical experiences of violence that are inherent to femininity, was, I guess, an attempt to say something about how female personality is constructed. Essentially, it is necessary to be severed from those experiences of the body in order, not to be a mad woman in the street punching people. So it's about civilization.
Okay, the question right at the back there, and one over there too. We'll begin with the lady in the middle there.
Hi, thank you so much. Is it me?
Yeah, it's you.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, I was just really struck by what you said about the terror of trying to enact authority in our own lives and kind of how that links to morality and writing. And I guess I was interested, do you see writing as a form of enacting authority in our lives? And if so, kind of, does that feel personal? Does that feel universal? And where does that conviction come from, I guess?
So I've said a lot about not liking writing and thinking I'd rather do something else. What I really, really like about writing is that it is a perfect truth system. If you understand it, obey it, know how to use it, are humble in your use of it, I think you can work pretty much anything out in that system. And that is an incredible idea to me. And I think particularly this point about, I mean, you know, morality and truth, you know, what's the relationship between those two things? I mean, I guess morality is truth over time. I mean, it's the conclusions that we draw from what we've learned to be true, which changes constantly. So I think that for people, writing still has, well, I say still, I mean has, a connection with truth in our lives because it's about telling and representing and about, you know, in our common currency of language. And I think people's questions about truth, whether what I see, what I experience, what I feel and know to be true is the same as what someone else in their head feels and knows to be true, or indeed what is the relationship between that and what is actually happening in front of me. And I think most people, well, most people who use language see language as a place where that tension, that question is in play and can always be, you know, opened up and resolved. So I do believe in it.
There was a question over there. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I was just thinking about some of the differences you were talking about between visual and literary forms and the burden of explanation. And I suppose one of the things that occurred to me is that you can take in a visual piece of art kind of all at once. You can look at it, whereas a book you have to kind of work your way through sentence by sentence or word by word. And I wondered if I guess you have a cover artwork, but there's a title, which is one of the ways I suppose a novelist can try to give the reader something like that, where you get to sort of, in this case, a single word of maybe trying to sum up in one kind of short sort of total way the book's concerns. And I just wanted to ask about the title Parade and how it came to be or how it relates to the book.
Well, I think it just popped into my head, probably. I think it was partly because it was quite an international word. It's parade in French, I think. Yeah. And also because it's a very ambiguous word, and it can be something joyous or it could be something militaristic and horrible. And I suppose also because the book has these component parts that I wanted to say that this is a book of component parts. Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question about a title, because the title is asserting some totality, I guess, to something that has a beginning, middle, and an end, which is extremely different, as you've pointed out, from standing and looking at a painting. And at the same time, that painting by Mark Rothko, costs many millions, and this book costs whatever it costs. So it's a more democratic experience, I guess.
I think we have time for one final question. There's a lady down there. Make it count.
Hi, I've only read 2 of your books, but I get the impression you write very much about the individual and how the individual relates to the world, back and forth. I'm wondering if you consider any of your books to be social commentary, and if social commentary about the world as it is today is something you believe you do or you want to do.
No, I think I worry. The thing I worry about most is my experience being non-representational, non-representative rather of enough enough people's experiences of things, and so the idea of social commentary, which I think probably in my earlier work, I used to kind of enjoy satire, for instance, and especially writing about the English in that form is very fun, because they kind of are asking for it. But no, now I think I'm trying to do something different, not comment, but I don't know, find things that are outside of the space of commentary, almost. Yeah.
Thank you. The previous question mentioned the artwork on the front cover, and it is extraordinary. And then in your answer, you referred to how the democratic nature of the book, and how particularly compared to a work of art, how cheap it is, which is half of my job now, directing our audience to the book stand at the back, where of course Parade is available. Rachel will be on stage signing those books. The ushers will direct you, but I believe the queue is going to start on stage left, this side of this stage. All that remains for me to say is please join me in saying a great big thank you to the wonderful Rachel Cusk.